at present, political debate can make it hard to be hopeful. I think whichever party forms a government after May the 7th, we're going to see a continuation of the austerity politics which has been in place since the financial crisis of 2008. And this is happening at the same time, and perhaps it's no coincidence, that as trust is declining in our mainstream political parties, perhaps it's starting to feel terminally. And also we're starting to see, what we have seen over the last few years, all of our kind of traditional establishment elites thrown into disrepute, as we see the banks, the police and the press. And it does start to feel that in a kind of increasingly complex and unsettling world that we don't have many choices, and it can seem hard to politically navigate. But the most important point that I want to make here is that we do have political choices, and the ones that we make are kind of create the society that we see. So I think that a useful starting point is the macro level of the economy. George Osborne's done a very skillful job of persuading the political world that there's no alternative to his fiscal framework. But we've done some work at the Fabian Society. We ran a commission on spending choices that suggested that perhaps there were constrained alternatives rather than no alternatives. So current plans imply sweeping cuts to the most important public services, and we've got a forthcoming bit of analysis looking at what happens to inequality in 2030 if we continue on this trajectory, and it shows kind of massive rising across the board. But our work set out what we thought was a plausible middle way of a 1% increase in real spending, which does mean you have very real spending decisions to make. But in particular, and I think what's particularly relevant to this agenda, is it stops the drift away from future-oriented kind of capital investment. I think also in the political landscape at the moment, it's worth thinking about the consequences of the autumn statement just before Christmas, which I think did start to change the tone of the political debate, where we started to kind of really think through the consequences of continuing on this trajectory. And you even had Paul Johnson of the IFS concluding that the role and shape of the state will have changed beyond recognition. So all of which means, I think, that the critical thing for this agenda is increasing the salience of environmental politics to ensure that the choices that we make, that we do have, are environmentally sustainable ones. And it's been a long-standing complaint that environmentalism has struggled to make a big enough impact on mainstream politics. I think we saw the high watermark of environmental politics probably towards the end of the last Parliament, where you had a committed, energetic rising star with the Prime Minister's ear as Secretary of State. His name was Ed Miliband, who delivered the Climate Change Act in 2008. But as the Great Recession kind of slowly exerted its hold over political debate, environmental issues increasingly became seen as frivolous and a distraction from the real task of returning to economic growth. And I think some people have been, many people have been critical of the fact that the current government hasn't lived up to its promise of being the greenest one ever. I think there's also been a lot of frustration on the Labour side that in a moment of a kind of once-in-a-generation political rethink of the creed of the left and the Labour Party as part of the policy review in opposition, environmental issues haven't been at the centre of the party's thinking, I think in a way that many people would have hoped, and the environment has felt somewhat peripheral. But I think it's a mistake to think that people don't care about the environment and to dismiss its political power. It's just that the popular understanding of it is different to the political one. And at the Fabian Society, we did a bit of work last year and published a report called Pride of Place, which I think in many ways sprung from the fact that pro-environmental sentiment did give us one of the biggest political news stories of this Parliament, which was the very high-profile public opposition to the attempt to sell off the forests, which I think showed the huge public opposition that people have around their land and where they live. So what we looked at in our work, we did a series of deliberative focus groups across the country. I kind of found that people think of the environment in terms of the place they live and the people that they live there with, rather than kind of climate change and carbon emissions, which has tended to be the language of environmentalism. So people have a strong sense of local attachment, which houses a really resonant spirit to conserve, which is something that we rarely are able to muster when we're thinking about the bigger global challenges. So our argument was that the political approach to environmentalism has tended to put the cart before the horse. So we need to build out from people's pride in their sense of place, rather than perhaps the focus that we've tended to take around the more abstract and transnational issues. So there were four main findings that we took from our kind of conversations with people, which I think hopefully kind of should inform how we think about environmental issues and how we can increase their saliency to mean that they are present in our political thinking. The first is that place is people. So we found that people really do have a strong attachment to the places they live. But this tends to be as much about the human relationships with the people that they live there with as much as it is about the natural or built environment. We found that environmentalism starts at home. So people need to be able to feel they can affect change in their own backyard before we can ask them to do the bigger things, perhaps, about changing the world. Third is the importance of the economy. We found that people quite often wanted to get more involved in their community, get more involved in protecting their kind of local spaces that they held dear, but just didn't have the time to do that or to put into it because they were, working long hours, perhaps commuting to live somewhere else, and often weren't, say, able to afford house prices to live in the area that they grow up with, where you do build an attachment with. So our argument was that environmentalism absolutely needs to engage more directly with the way that the modern economy functions. And the fourth thing we found was around something we called the chemistry of community. People do feel a strong sense of loss, believing that community spirit has declined over time. But quite often the thing that stops them getting involved in the community is they feel that communities are made up of cliques, which can be hard to get involved in. So we need to encourage kind of wider participation in community life. So what I think here is environmental politics that speaks to everyone, because it's about antisocial behaviour, it's about parks, it's about litter, it's about woodland, it's about the places people live and the people they live there with, which I think speaks to all parts of political parties' coalition. So I think it resonates very strongly with some of the big society thinking that there's been in the Conservative Party. I think on the Labour side, there's really a particular relevance for a party that's kind of concerned about the fragmenting of its electoral coalition, and you've seen the Green surge on one side and losing votes to UKIP on the other side. I think here is an environmental politics which unites both, and you can speak about the environment in Brighton just in the same way as you might do in Thurrock or Grimsby. So I think it shows not just a broad case for environmental politics, but also specifically for green infrastructure, which invests in the landscape that really matters to people. So it's a different way of thinking about politics. But I think also we need to include a different way of thinking about the economy. So mainstream policy making has tended to take a very narrow view of the role of the environment in our economic thinking. George Osborne said a few years ago at a Conservative Party conference that we're not going to save the planet by putting Britain out of business. But I think we've reached a point where it's impossible to talk about sustainable economic growth without talking about environmental sustainability. And this is something that many businesses are increasingly recognising, that in a world of finite resources and rapid depletion, a sustainable supply chain is absolutely crucial to long-term profitability. You see companies like Unilever and Marks & Spencer's putting this absolutely at the heart of their business model. The Natural Capital Committee very recently concluded that there's a significant opportunity for the next government to enhance natural capital to ensure sustainable economic growth. And this is very much the argument that the Aldersgate Group have been making about how the natural environment, well-being, sustainability are at the heart of a thriving economy. So I think there are kind of opportunities to advance this argument. Marie Regal, the Shadow Environment Secretary, has talked about putting the Natural Capital Committee's recommendations at the heart of Labour's policy thinking. I think there are various institutions that we currently have which could be explored and put to work in this agenda. I think local enterprise partnerships, the LEPs, have a considerable amount of funding to promote economic development in their area, and so these need to be where businesses and local authorities work together to ensure that environmental issues are at the heart of our economic thinking. Also, I think on a kind of in terms of the future spending plans of the different parties, Labour and the Liberal Democrats do at least allow for extra infrastructure spending with capital investment exempt from their fiscal rules. So I think there is a kind of realistic target for advocacy that, you know, there are areas where spending provides public goods and that green infrastructure should be at the heart of it. The final point I want to make is that I think we need to kind of raise our sights a little bit in all this. John Cruddas, who chaired the Labour Party's policy review, has talked of a radical hope that the current limitations and I think the realisation that the old way that we had of doing things wasn't achieving results, offers exciting possibilities to try new things. And I think there is a lot in this, but I also think that we're starting to reach the end of local councils being able to make obvious efficiencies through reorganisation. Simon Parker, who's the director of the New Local Government Network, has made the point that we're reaching the end of local councillors and staff members' ability to just soak up more work to achieve efficiencies. And we are in a position where only a third of people have noticed the impact of the cuts. But I think when it starts really impacting on the local things that people care about, and I think those things are like green spaces, like our playgrounds, like woodland, then I think that will begin to change. And I think it's important that we make the case that these things matter as public institutions, kind of in and of themselves, and it's not just about their tangible benefits. And also that this isn't an agenda that can be delivered for nothing. So I think political leadership is going to be crucial to make sure that we make the case for continued investment in our public realm.